Three, two. Beautiful. We're live. We got Rhett Reese on the podcast today. Rhett, how you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Mitch. How are
Yeah,
you?
of course. I'm doing well. How about yourself?
All good. All good. Got the kids down to sleep and ready to talk Hollywood.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I feel like we have a lot to talk about. Thank you so much for making the time to do this, 'cause I know how busy you are.
My pleasure.
Um, but I guess just to start out, maybe just give. I know your kind of your story, but maybe just give a little background story about how you got into the industry, and then we'll kind of dive into some of your projects and some upcoming projects as well.
Absolutely. I came out here without much of a clue of what I wanted to do, apart from be in the movie business, so to speak. And I got a job as a production assistant on a movie. And the best thing about that was that it gave me a window into what pretty much everybody does on a movie. And I used to look at the credits when I first yeah, entertained dreams of going to Hollywood and thought to myself, I'd like to do any of those jobs. But then when I realized what everybody did, I thought, I'm not really qualified for any of those jobs except perhaps writing, directing, or editing. Those were the three things in my head that I thought maybe I could do. And the only one of those three that really required no capital and no great investment, other than just personal manpower and brain power, was writing. And so I convinced my parents to kind of pay my rent for a couple of years. I mean, I don't know how I was just a very lucky young man, fortunate, privileged young man that my parents were willing to do that for me. And I started writing, and I wrote 7 screenplays, and it was the 7th one basically that got noticed, and I was right on the cusp of quitting. I really was. It was a grind. I hadn't received any money for my work. I hadn't sniffed much more than a few positive comments here and there, and I was on the verge of going to business school when suddenly one of my scripts started to gain traction. Not It didn't sell or it didn't get optioned, but it was deemed good as sort of a writing sample. So I started to get interviews for actual jobs, and I started working in the children's space. So my first job was writing for Jim Henson Productions. I wrote a treatment for a Muppet movie for them, and then quickly moved over to Disney and wrote a live action script for them, and then Disney Animation, and then Pixar, and one job led to another, and I was a working screenwriter, and so that's how I got into it. It was just sweat equity and writing 7 different scripts in 7 different genres, and it was finally the 7th one that popped.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's such a tried and true. I feel like, everybody's story is a little bit different, but there's a grind, I feel like, to everybody's story, um, that I've talked to, at least in
Absolutely.
Hollywood.
There's a dues paying that goes on. Because you have an industry that's full of people who already have the jobs you're seeking, right? And those people have to kind of retire out of it in order to create space for young people. And so those first few years in general are a bit of a grind.
Yeah, it's like you have your legends that are so kind of entrenched in the industry.
Ensconced, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I guess for your sake, and maybe just like, I feel like the audience might want to hear this, but um, in terms of when after you wrote all those scripts, kind of how do you get it out there? Because I feel like there's so many people these days that are just writing scripts, um, and
Trying to figure out how to distribute them.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's an age-old question. I think the real answer to the question is that everybody is no more than a degree or two of separation away from a person who could really change their career and change their life.
yeah,
Um, i- it's it's the pressure's on you as a writer, if you're writing or if you're creating anything, to create something so compelling and so great that when someone sees it or reads it, they're no longer doing you a favor by showing it to somebody else. They're doing themselves a favor by showing it to somebody else and doing a favor to the person they're showing it to. When you have a piece of material or you're talented enough for that to start to come together, it doesn't take long for a script to move from somebody who doesn't have a ton of power necessarily, but has a relationship with somebody else who has a relationship with one more person. It doesn't take long for the script to move into the hands of either an agent or a producer or an executive or a manager or an actor or somebody who has the kind of power who could really make it happen or start to make it happen.
Yeah.
And so I tell young people to drop their script from the helicopter, so to speak. That's the metaphor I usually use, which is just show it to everybody and anybody who will look at it, even the most tenuous link to you. I mean, it could be your brother's friend's cousin's assistant or something, but everybody in this town is no more than a degree or two of separation away from somebody who could change your life. And you need that person to get excited and start to share it. And that's exactly what happened to me. I had some young managers and producers like my stuff and start to shop it around, and I ultimately landed a manager that way. But it was all incumbent on the material itself being strong enough to motivate somebody else to say, "Oh my gosh, this is great, and I'm going to give it to my friend."
Yeah. Yeah, so that's how you started. You just or and that's kind of what you did too, and you just by a shadow of a doubt landed a manager, and it was off to the races from there.
Yeah, it was kind of off to the races. And this was the old days when I had physical scripts,
Oh
right? We
yeah.
didn't have email, and we so I would have to hand the script to somebody, which was always a pain. But technology really has made it easier to distribute your stuff from your desk. You really don't need to leave your house, and I think you just have to be shameless. You know,
Yeah.
exploit every contact you have. Don't worry about, is the contact too tenuous, or do I know this person well enough, or am I being a bull in a china shop? You kind of have to take your shots, and some of them won't work out, a lot of them won't, but a lot of, a few of them, or even just one of them, that one key one may be the lead that you need to spark a career.
Yeah. And I feel like uh your story too has an aspect of perseverance, right? I mean, you just can't quit. You just got to keep doing it and you can't get
It really
discouraged.
did. I mean, I was low, low, low because I'd written 7 scripts, and I thought, man, if I can't attract somebody by number 7, like maybe I should consider something else. Now, I did intend to go to business school and then come back to Hollywood. The great thing about Hollywood is there are a gazillion jobs that come at it from many different angles. So you could be a lawyer, you could be a animal wrangler, you could be a personal trainer, you could be an editor, a writer, a director, a grip, an electrician. There's a million different ways to partake in this town and be a valuable member of it, without having to just do one thing, in that case, writing. So I was planning on going to business school and then possibly coming back and working as an executive, or maybe a money pusher kind of type. But my writing dreams were on the verge of falling apart. But I guess one of the weird lessons was that my second script, interestingly, sold 12 years after I wrote it and actually became a movie. So it was the second script I wrote out of college. And I think the lesson there is that there is no final no, right? There's no uh, finish line necessarily. You could hear no's for 12 years and finally get the yes that leads you to a movie. So it does really, the implication is that don't give up, right?
Yeah.
Because that's really the only way you can really exit the town, is to give up. If you're after it, there still may be a chance, and there's a lesson in that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's crazy that your second script became a movie.
It did, and that
Well,
was a bad movie. It was well, I mean, it was sort of a B movie. It was Cruel Intentions 3, straight to video. So it's not like it was some masterpiece, but it was a viable script, and I wrote it, basically 1 year out of college. So I did have some talent, but that one took a full 12 years to cook before it finally happened. So
oh my gosh. So where does your love for film, kind of like your initial dream? I know you're from Arizona. Your initial dream um, to come out here, obviously, you know, I feel like a
yeah,
lot
I
of
mean, I
kids that
think
are,
it was just a love of movies. I grew up on, the biggies, Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark, movies like that, and they really, really inspired me and instilled in me a love of movies. And then as I aged up, I fell in love with Woody Allen, and I fell in love with movies like that were a little more adult in theme, like Silence of the Lambs and Field of Dreams and things like that.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to college, I just thought, I want to go out there. I just want to go out there and see what happens, and see whether I am a storyteller at heart, because I did love to tell stories. I like to write as a young person. And I think it was this confluence of writing and of a love for movies that led me to screenwriting.
And you didn't have many leads when you came out here. It was just kind of like a
Zero.
okay.
I was completely at sea. My dad knew a guy who knew William Peterson's brother.
Okay.
William Peterson was the star of CSI, and he's a wonderful actor. And so it was like my dad's friend knew William Peterson's brother, and through that connection, Billy Peterson got me my production assistant job. And then I became his assistant on a made for TNT movie. And that was where I got a chance to see what everybody did.
Okay.
But that was about the only connection I had with regard to writing. I had to pound the pavement completely. I started from total scratch.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I feel like if you come out here even without, a lot of connections, it's pretty easy to at least get like a PA or something just to get on a set because there's so many just to kind of see, what it's
Yes.
like. And then from there, you just, like you said, just pick your kind of interests and grind the pavement from there.
Yeah, and build that contact base and make friends. I mean, all those friends you're who are your peers at age 21 start to age up and they move into jobs. And so over time, that generation becomes the most powerful generation. It just takes time. And the more contacts and friends you make over time, those will oftentimes pay off.
Yeah. Yeah, so now I want to talk about how you connected with Paul because you
Yes.
collaborated with Paul on a lot of your bigger movies, I would say. Um, and kind of how did
Ye-
that relationship come together and
Yeah, I mean, a writing partner, it can be real happenstance. In
okay.
this case, we didn't even start as writing partners. I was a screenwriter and he was a producer working in reality TV.
Okay.
And one night, we were watching the show. He was working on Big Brother. And he said, we had to come up with an idea for a reality show sometime. And that night, the two of us came up with the idea for the Joe Schmo Show, which is a show we ended up making and selling, which was essentially a hybrid of his background and my background. It was a reality television show with a heavily scripted element.
Okay.
It was essentially like the Truman Show in a reality setting. And we found a guy, we brought him on a reality show where he lived in a house with 9 other people, and they voted each other off, all the other reality shows. The only difference was that all the other 9 people in the house were actors pretending to be reality contestants, and we were writing a full-on comedy around this one guy who had no idea that he was the only real contestant in the
Oh
house.
my God.
This was in 2003, and it was a crazy show. It was a crazy time in reality television where kind of anything went. We were two young guys. We sold it to this little tiny network, and we ended up making it for Spike TV. And it was like they were just small enough and just crazy enough to take a risk on these two young kids. I mean, we were kids. We were
Yeah.
30 years old essentially, but still they put this reality show on our hands and it turned out awesomely. And so we ended up working in that space in reality TV, making these weird scripted hybrid reality shows for about 5 years. And then at the end of that, it was starting to dry up on us, and our shows were very high risk, high reward, and we were having trouble selling them mostly due to the risk. And I basically convinced Paul. I said, "Why don't we just screenwrite? Why don't we get into screenwriting?" It was what I did. You're a kind of a storyteller at heart. He'd come up through news. He was a news producer, on a TV news producer, and then a reality producer. But he was a storyteller too, from a different angle. And uh, and so I convinced him to do Zombieland. And Zombieland we wrote as a television pilot. We sold it as a television pilot. Thank God CBS never made it. The rights came back to us essentially, and we ended up turning it into a movie for Sony. And that was our first entree into screenwriting. And by God, it got made. And next thing you know, we had a screenwriting career. So I was back where I started after about a 5 year detour into reality TV. But Paul and I had gone to high school together. We were buddies since the 80s, and we're just good friends. And by happenstance, I think with writing partnerships, you don't have to marry somebody. You can basically say, hey, let's try to write one script together, or let's do one project together and just see how it goes.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it goes nowhere and the partnership dissolves. Oftentimes it doesn't sell, but the partnership seems strong and you keep going. And then sometimes it really works, it sells, and then you run with it. And that's exactly what happened to us. And here we are, something like 23 years later, we're still writing partners. So it's like, it's crazy.
Yeah, that's incredible. That the Joe Schmo show, I didn't know that's what that was. That sounds like it could be like a YouTuber show these days, like if someone does like a
Well,
digital.
interestingly, there was a sort of variation on it that just became very popular called jury duty. And I don't know if you heard of it, but basically they put this guy on what he thought was a real jury. In fact, it was a fake jury with actors all pretending to be jurors, and they were all performing a comedy, a loosely scripted comedy around him. And they've been interviewed, some of those guys, and they were said that one of their inspirations was our show from 2003. I mean, it was sort of a cult cult hit back then, and it was a blast. I mean, that was still to this date our favorite project.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Um, okay, so you and Paul went to high school together, and he came up in the news world and reality, and then you kind of just convinced him to help you write Zombieland. That's
That's
crazy.
exactly right.
Um, so let's talk about. Well, I want to ask you first about one movie before we talk about this other thing. But one of the movies that I didn't know was written by you that I discovered is Life, and
Oh yeah.
I remember watching that movie in college, and um, I was like, this movie is really good, and the ending is just crazy. That crazy turn at the end.
Oh man.
And when I saw that was written by you, I texted a couple of my friends that had watched it with me. Um, what was the inspiration behind that?
So what happened was David Ellison, who runs
Uh
Skydance,
huh.
he always wanted to make a horror movie set on the International Space Station in a zero gravity environment
Yeah.
because he's really obsessed with astronauts and people who take risks, and he really loved the idea of doing something in zero G's. And so, Alien was one of my favorite movies. It was a movie that by the time we did Life had been out for at least 30 years, something like that. So,
Yeah.
and there hadn't been a lot of, there were knockoffs earlier, but there hadn't been a lot of movies made in that space for a while, sci-fi horror. And so he just gave us that idea. He just said a horror movie on the International Space Station where they bring a sample of life back from Mars and it comes to life on the station. That was the log line. And so we said, all right, we'll execute that for you. And we did a deep dive, a lot of research into astronauts and horrible things that had either happened to astronauts or that astronauts had happened to them, or risks that they entailed when they were doing their work. One of which was somebody drowning, nearly drowning in his spacesuit when the coolant leaked up into his helmet. So we decided to make that a set piece in the movie. But we had this vision for a creature that didn't that cells didn't distinguish themselves from each other. So every cell in the creature's body was a eye cell and a muscle cell and a brain cell all in one. And so we thought of this sort of amorphous creature that was super smart and adaptable and could kind of move very quickly and adeptly through a zero G environment. That was sort of the inspiration. And then we just thought of all these haunted house tricks to force our characters into small spaces, and where is it, and it's trapped in here with us and we don't know where, and it's very resilient. And then I had seen an interview with Shane Black,
Uh huh.
who's a famous writer, and he talked about this writing process he uses whereby um, not actors, characters get themselves into trouble and then solve the problem, but in so doing create another problem, and then that problem they go to solve that and another problem gets created. And I applied that thinking to a space station, Paul and I did.
Yeah.
And if you watch these poor characters, they don't really make a single dumb decision. At least we tried to make them make smart decisions, and yet every decision kept cascading into another problem, and until this twist ending, in which I don't know if I should spoil it, but you kind of mentioned it. But there's this great well, at least we thought it was great twist ending
Oh, it was
where
amazing.
you think one thing has happened, and in fact something else has happened. And we had a great time writing that script, and I think Daniel Espinosa did a wonderful job capturing Zero G. It didn't do great at the box office. We set it up for a sequel. You know, if you remember the end, it
Yeah.
was definitely, uh, pointing towards a possible sequel. The movie didn't do enough box office, and I think that it was generally received well. I mean, I think where it was criticized was just, hey, it's another Alien knockoff, right? And it's just, and that was Alien cast a very long shadow. It's an amazing movie. So we never quite got out from under that shadow, but we were proud of the movie overall.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll tell you that me and my friend both loved it so much, and we talk about it still to this day. So we had a great time
That's great.
experiencing
That's
it.
very gratifying to hear.
Yeah,
We've heard similar things where they're just super fans of that movie, and it just wasn't seen by that many folks.
it's like it was like an anxiety attack the whole movie, and then you think it's over, and then the
Yeah,
end.
exactly.
It was awesome. Well, I gotta ask you about Deadpool because
Yes,
it's such a massive franchise and one of my favorite characters, I guess, in the Marvel universe. Um,
it's
how,
changed our life.
yeah, I mean, I feel like it's just changed the landscape of superhero movies, just kind of in general. Um, how did that come about? Deadpool one, and then kind of we'll lead into the rest of it. But
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Well, Deadpool 1, we were really fortunate. We had written Zombieland, and we were starting to be taken pretty seriously after Zombieland came out into theaters, as screenwriters who could tackle action and comedy together. And so Fox was looking for someone to adapt this comic book, or these series of comic books. There were a few different ones. Um, about a character called Deadpool. Now, we had never heard of Deadpool because we had left our comic days behind. Like, I was a big comics fan in high school, but I
yeah,
didn't really carry it into adulthood like some people do. So I didn't know who Deadpool was. So Paul and I got given all these comics, and we did a deep dive over the course of like 3 or 4 days, read a bunch of the comics, and then we went in and pitched. And Ryan Reynolds was attached to play Deadpool because he'd played Wade Wilson in this Wolverine movie, and he was the driving force behind it. He really always wanted to play Deadpool. So he was attached already as a producer. So we interviewed with Ryan and with Fox at the same time. And our pitch was a bit of a dud. It didn't go that well. We didn't, I guess we didn't really understand what Ryan wanted to do. We did not pitch the origin story of Deadpool. We pitched a current story of Deadpool where his origin had already happened.
okay,
And because we were just a little sick of origin stories at that point.
yeah,
And that's why we did it. And it was just a creative choice we made. Well, it didn't resonate with Ryan at all, and he didn't go for it, so we didn't get the job. And our agent Phil Damacore, to his great credit, um, what happened was Ryan not only didn't like our pitch, but he didn't like the pitch of any of the other writers either. So he ended up back at square one. And our agent said, "Hey, I know you didn't like Paul and Rhett's pitch, but I think you should read this pilot of theirs." And it was a pilot we'd written with, sorry, not with, for Todd Field, the director over at HBO. And it was about a voyeur. It was a very dark pilot about a voyeur, called Watch.
okay,
And to this day, still one of my favorite things of ours. And we worked with Todd Field, who's a total genius. And we ended up with this script that never went anywhere, but it was a pretty powerful little script. And Phil sent it to Ryan Reynolds. Our agent sent it to Ryan Reynolds and said, "Just read this, and if you think the guys are just horror comedy or action comedy writers, look at this. It's sort of a deep psychological dive into this guy's weirdness." And Deadpool was a weird character. So Ryan, to his credit, listened to Phil and said, "All right, I'll check it out." So he read it and he loved it. And so he said, "I'd love to sit down with you guys." So we went to the Chateau Marmont for lunch with Ryan Reynolds, and we just talked Deadpool for like 2 hours. We sat there, and Ryan said, "Here's the thing. I want it to be an origin story. I don't want to duck the cancer of it all. I want him to get cancer. I want to start from the beginning." And we said, "Awesome." We'd been told at that point that he wanted to do an origin story. So we just started bouncing ideas off each other. And by the end of the 2 hours, Ryan said, "All right, I'm going to get you hired on this. I'm going to convince Fox to hire you." And so he went back and he wrote this long email to Fox about why he thought we were the guys, even though they didn't love our first pitch. And he convinced them that we would just build it from the ground up. That they didn't need to hear us pitch. That our ideas were in sync, and that the three of us could figure it out. And so Fox said sure. So Ryan hired us, and we talked the story through over the series of about 3 or 4 meetings in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
and at the end of that, we went off to write this. We pitched it to Fox, and our executive Drew Cervello really liked it. Had a couple of very good suggestions. We took those from him, and we went off and wrote it. And then we waited 6 years. I mean, it essentially was like, I don't know if it was 6 years, but it was a long time. Fox basically got it and just didn't know quite what to do with it, and it bounced around there for a bit, and then they did bring a director on, and Tim Miller, and they gave him some money to make a test with his VFX studio. And so he created this little short test. I don't know if you ever saw it on the internet. It's out there of a scene, basically a one scene from Deadpool, the scene where he jumps off the freeway and lands in the SUV and fights the guys at
Yeah.
the top
Yeah.
of the movie. And Ryan came in and did the dialogue, and we thought that was going to get us over the hump, but it just didn't. Fox still couldn't quite wrap their head around it. So this is years passing now. And to Tim Miller's great credit, he wouldn't take no for an answer, and he just kept nudging and pushing. And he had friends in high places. He was a good buddy with David Fincher. He had David Fincher read it, and David Fincher put in a good word for us. And then he had James Cameron read it. And, James Cameron, to his great credit, read it overnight and called Fox and was like, "Why aren't you doing this?" And he was just awesome. It still didn't get us over the hump, though, shockingly. And then my writing partner, Paul, to his great credit, basically said, I just can't stomach the idea of this thing dying. And Tim and Ryan at one point had said similar things, but it was in a cool period where no one was doing anything. And Paul wrote an email to Simon Kinberg. So Simon Kinberg is a very wonderful writer and producer, and he had a very good relationship with Emma Watts over at Fox, and Tom Rothman at the time. Sorry. Anyway, but it was mostly Emma.
Yeah.
And long story short, within a week we had a green light. Simon read the script, and he loved it, and he said, "I want to come on board as a producer, and I want to convince Emma to do it." And we said, "Awesome." And so he went to Emma, and he said, "Look, you got to do this. It's just, you got to do it." And Emma, thankfully, uh, trusted in Simon, reread the script, saw the merits in it where she hadn't entirely before, where they hadn't entirely before. I think she'd always loved it, but in any case, so she started pushing uphill, and we had a green light a week later. It was crazy.
Oh my gosh, that's a
And then we
crazy.
made it, and we had very little interference from the studio. We were out in Vancouver. I mean, to be honest, it was just a movie kind of made. It was made by a bunch of people, but at the top it was Tim Miller and Ryan Reynolds and me and Paul,
Yeah.
and they basically left us alone to go make this crazy movie. And uh, at the end, there was a little confusion in the early research screenings with the time jumps. You know how the movie jumps from present to past and jumps around.
Yeah.
And the studio got cold feet for a second, and they asked to see a chronological cut where it was all cut together chronologically. We told them it wouldn't work, and when they saw it, I think they realized it wouldn't work because it was basically two movies. It was this first 35 minutes of just dire cancer and torture and a lab and all this stuff, and then suddenly it was this wacky character appears at about 35 minutes in and carries it through the rest of the movie, and it just didn't work tonally. It was like this somber drama followed by this crazy comedy.
Yeah.
And so they realized, no, you're right. Let's just try to clear up the confusion where we can, but let's leave the fractured time narrative. And by God, we finally got it honed down, and we got a research screening that just blew up, and we suddenly realized we had something on our hands, and it was just so exciting. It was just such an exciting ride.
That's incredible. So years after it was written, before
Yeah,
it got made.
a full 6 years, I think, before the process was 6 years. I mean, I think we wrote it very quickly. So we wrote it in the first whatever 5 or 6 months of those 6 years, and then the next 5.5 years was just pushing uphill.
Yeah. So then after the obviously the enormous success, was two kind of like full steam ahead, and did you
It
jump?
was, and yet, sequels to very successful movies, they invite a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah.
They're accompanied by a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear of can we top the first one, and what's the right story to tell, and who's coming back and who isn't, and who's new and who isn't, and a million different directions you can go. It was a labor of love. Two was tough. We started writing it before one came out because I think they started to see the handwriting on the wall. And we were mostly left alone, and we're cooking up a story for number two. And then the movie came out, number one came out, and I remember this guy from Forbes wrote an article trying to predict how well it was going to do, and he said, I think it's going to do somewhere between 50 million and 125 million dollars, which is like a ridiculously big window, right? Like
Yeah.
that's like a 75 million dollar window, and he still missed low. It opened to 132 million, so it was like above even his highest estimate. It did so well, and suddenly there was all this pressure. I think there was all this anxiety and pressure on Ryan and on us and on the studio to get it right, and it just ended up being a grind for about another year. Like we ended up tossing out the version that we were working on,
Yeah.
um, and we didn't arrive at the version that ended up in theaters until 9 months later, something like that. And then we
Oh,
wrote that, and finally we got there. But it was definitely a difficult labor of love, number two.
okay. Wow. It's like yeah, there's even a grind on massive projects, even
Yeah, I mean sequels, I think, just invite a grind because there's so much anxiety attached to them. You've got this golden goose now, and it can lay golden eggs, but if you mess it up and it doesn't lay a golden egg, you've lost the goose, in the process somehow. I guess that's a bad metaphor, but the bottom line is there's just a lot of pressure that
yeah.
comes with a sequel. Whereas that first movie, nobody knew what Deadpool was. They didn't care.
Right.
We made it for $60 million, which for a superhero movie is almost nothing, and they just didn't have a sense of how big it could be even until we started to get some momentum in marketing and stuff like that. So there was just very little scrutiny, very little pressure. We were just winging it. And then the second movie, it was like all eyeballs were on us, man. It was not fun.
Yeah, and I mean, as the audience and fans, obviously, there's pressure from them
Them
too.
too.
Right. Yeah, you got to deliver, and the comic book junkies, I'm sure, are
Yeah, they're out there sharpening their knives, right? There's very much of a what have you done for me lately quality to it. It's like I relate it to being a sports star, whereas you can be the biggest star in the world, right? You're just biggest baseball, best baseball player in the world. You get into the World Series, and the first three games happen, and you go hitless. In those first three games, like people are already the rumblings are there, right? It's like
yeah,
what the hell's wrong with him? What's going on? Like it doesn't take long. Wouldn't take long for even the biggest NBA star or the biggest the top whatever football star, whatever. You have three games in a row that are bad, or just a little bit, and they start to sharpen their knives. So we always know that we have to stay ahead of those jaws and those teeth and continue to do good work, or at least the best work we can do.
yeah. No, for sure. So what can you tell us about three?
I can't really tell you much of anything. I mean, I
Okay.
can't. What I can tell you is sort of already out there,
Yeah.
which is that we did struggle for a while figuring out what the movie was again. I mean, it was just like, what story are we telling? We got this double-edged sword of a blessing slash curse of entering the Marvel universe, or entering Disney, I should say, where we
Yeah.
had access to all the Marvel characters. And the blessing was that we had access to a bunch of stuff. The curse was it was almost like we had access to too much stuff. Like we didn't really, nobody really knew what to do. And it wasn't until Hugh Jackman and Ryan talked, and Hugh indicated that he would really love to play Wolverine again, that it became clear that it was going to be a two-hander between Deadpool and Wolverine, and then it got a lot easier.
Okay.
It's like all the angst over what is this movie going to be dissolved, and it became what's the very best movie we can make about Wolverine and Deadpool.
Yeah.
And so everything narrowed, like all those possibilities sort of fell away, and it narrowed to, okay, we know what movie we're telling now. And then it was just a blast, right?
Yeah.
We had a 5-person essentially writing team in Ryan Reynolds and Zeb Wells and Paul Wernick. Zeb Wells is a writer who had been working for Marvel, so they wanted someone from their side, quote unquote.
Okay.
And then Sean Levy's our director, was working with Ryan, and then Paul and I. So the 5 of us were kind of like a big writer's room or something, or a writing team is the best way to describe it. And we just ham and egged our way through this movie and had a blast. It's super fun. And we really are happy with it. And that's about all I can say. I mean,
Okay.
you've seen the marketing materials, so
Sure.
there's some stuff that's clearly out there.
Yeah.
Um, but they'll chop my head off if I reveal anything, so I have to be careful talking about it. But we're very proud of it.
I'm excited for it. I can't wait to see it. So I guess going back to kind of the original Deadpool 1 story, you said Ryan was kind of attached to it. Is that pretty common in writing where like an actor is attached to a project, or is it?
I would say usually not. I mean, it can be
Yeah.
because some actors have production companies, and they ferret out their own material and they come up with their own ideas, and then they seek out writers to execute them. So it can work out that way. But usually what we find is that actors don't like to attach to projects until there is a script and until there is a director. Like those two pieces are
Yeah.
usually need to be in place for an actor to really commit to something. Unless it was something that it was the actor's idea, something the actor fell in love with. In this case, Ryan had fallen in love with the Deadpool comics. He really did love Deadpool.
Yeah.
And he basically felt that it had been given very short shrift and had not been treated well in that Wolverine movie, like, because it hadn't. It was terrible. It was not a good version of Wade Wilson and Deadpool. So he was very passionate about it, and it was kind of ground up from the actor. And that does happen sometimes. Actors, like everyone, do fall in love with things, and sometimes want to make them, and sometimes have companies in place to acquire material and go make them. So that can certainly happen. But most often we find that the idea, the writing, the director, the script, all of that kind of comes first, and then you go find the actors.
Okay. And then I guess a question on top of that is how, after you're done writing a script and it gets greenlit by the studio, how much are you involved throughout the process? Is it kind of
Yeah,
different?
it's a great question.
Yeah.
And the answer is it really, really depends. Like, writers are very, very disposable in Hollywood. Feature screenwriters are very disposable. So
Yeah.
oftentimes you'll see 6 or 7 writers on a project, and you go, what the heck happened? And invariably it's because the script ends up not satisfying everybody, and it's in a state of what they call development, and they lose faith in the original writer, and they decide to hire somebody else to try to fix it, and then they lose faith in that person, they decide to hire someone else to fix it, and then there are a million other reasons why writers come and go.
Yeah.
Executives can leave, and new executives can bring in their favorites, or actors can come in and demand their favorite writers come on. Directors oftentimes rewrite or bring in their favorite writers to rewrite. So oftentimes you get fired off your own movie. It's happened multiple times to us. It's a terrible, terrible feeling, and I don't uh, I don't recommend it. If I were an executive or a director or an actor, I would try to keep the singular voice and keep the same writer throughout, because I just think it's better. But oftentimes it just works out the other way, and there are multiple writers on a project. But when the movie gets green lit, it starts in terms of what writing needs to still be done. It's really up to how comfortable everybody is and happy everybody is with the existing script, because like, oftentimes the existing script is beloved and the director loves it and doesn't really want to change much and resists change from the actors, and they just go shoot it. It's like, and they improvise a little bit, but they largely shoot the script.
Yeah.
Other times the script's not in good shape, and the director and the studio and the actors are still unhappy with it, and you've got writers out on set rewriting scenes the night before they shoot, even. Like, it's just crazy, but oftentimes that does happen. And I guess most often it's probably it's a little bit more the former case. You hope to not be in charge of a movie where the latter is happening, where it's in such dire straits that people are writing out there every day.
Yeah,
Um, and so the other big factor as to whether the writer's still involved is the director, right? Or the actors. Like, do they want the writer involved? Do they want a writer on set? Do they want a writer to be uh, on staff and still working during those times when you're actually shooting and or in the base? And we lucked out. I mean, on Zombieland, Ruben Fleischer, we had written the script. Ruben Fleischer came on to direct it, and he's a great guy, and we hit it off with him, and he wanted us to stay involved. And so we were on the Zombieland set every day. And
that's
I can't
awesome.
remember whether they paid for us to be there. We might have had to pay our own way. And actually, I think they probably did pay for us on that one. And then Deadpool 1, Ryan just said, "Look, you have to be there. Like, you just have to be there." And so Deadpool's 1 and 2, we were on set every day. And most often we didn't do much over the course of the day, except maybe a suggestion here, a suggestion there, and an improv line here or there, that kind of thing. But we didn't do a ton. But Paul and I's mantra was, if we can change one thing that helps the movie in the course of a day, we've helped, and it was worth us being there. And so we would try to have one tiny impact on the movie every day. So there have been some movies where we've been out there every day. There have been other movies where we've had nothing to do with it. Like, the minute the director comes on board, we're gone. They go off and shoot it, they edit it, and we show up in the movie theater. And then we've had different variations in between. Michael Bay was terrific on Six Underground about inviting us out to set. We weren't working, but he invited us out to set. He showed us what was going on. And then in the Bay, he had us come in and watch the cut and offer suggestions and stuff. So it's really about your relationship with the director and how much or how little they want you around. Some directors love having writers around. Others feel threatened by them and or just don't feel the need for them, and so you're not there.
That's got to be a cool feeling, like being on set, kind of just
Oh
watching it.
man, it's really fun. Every scene is like Christmas morning, right? You get to watch this amazing actor say your lines. You get to see what works and what doesn't, and react in real time. It's can be super fun, and then it's also a bit of drudgery too, because mostly sitting on a movie set is either waiting or repetition. It's either you wait, you wait, you wait, you wait, you wait, and then when you do finally shoot something, it's fresh about the first two or three times you hear it, and then because of all the different angles they cover it from, you end up hearing the same lines delivered 60, 70 times, and by the end of it you're like, oh my gosh, please, let's move on. So I wouldn't call a set the most exciting place in the world, um, but but it can be really fun. I mean, there are just moments where you just feel like you're walking 6 inches above the ground. There was a moment on Deadpool 2 where, I don't know if you remember the scene where all the X-Force jumps out of the plane and they all die. I don't know if you remember that scene, but
I,
they all like that. And Ryan and Rob Delaney and the various other actors, Zazie Beetz and everybody who were playing characters who were jumping out of the plane, like they're jumping out of this fake plane onto this pad, and just as a group, we were laughing so hard. Like, it was such a fun night. Like, we were just, and you're sitting there watching it and going, I can't believe I get paid to do this. Like, I can't believe I get to be here. I can't believe I get to watch this. Beaming smiles and laughter on everybody's face. The whole crew's cracking up, and it's the camaraderie of it, and the knowledge that you're putting something to film that will someday come out in a theater and entertain hopefully millions of people. Like, it can be super fun.
yeah, I'm sure it makes it all worth it too. Just your grind that you went through to make it.
Oh
Just
man, it really does. And you
yeah.
have these memories associated with the film that nobody else has when you're out on set. Like, every scene, you're like, oh, I remember that day. I remember what we were doing, and it's like that was a night shoot, and it was cold, or I was sick that day, or Matt Damon came in to do his cameo that day, and that was the most exciting thing ever. And you just remember these things for the rest of your life.
This is funny. I heard this recently from a Chris Hemsworth interview, but is it hard to watch movies that aren't yours because you're kind of just analyzing, like, I wonder how they did that. I wonder how they, because he says that like Mad Max Fury Road was like the only movie that he really just kind of was engulfed in. But other movies nowadays, he's just always analyzing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Mitch. I think that the quality of the movie generally determines how much you're analyzing it. And if it's a bad movie, I think I start to pull back and analyze it and start to pick it apart and notice the bad screenwriting moves and the bad whatever, just anything that's bad, like I'm just analyzing it. If it's a really good movie, I get lost in it. I mean, I forget that I'm a screenwriter kind of.
Yeah.
And it does bum me out sometimes. I know a lot of the tricks of the trade, so
Right.
when the tricks get played, I often go, I'm oftentimes at least conscious of it and
Mm-hmm.
going, oh, that was a nice move, or there, that's tried and true. We've used that before, kind of thing. So there's a little bit of that, but generally, if the movie's really, really good, you can sit back and just enjoy it and not analyze it too much. And almost sometimes just get pumped, like, oh my God, they hit that note perfectly. And it's just like you're almost like you're a little cheerleader for the screenwriter, who
Yeah.
did it. Just go, oh, that was awesome. I wish I'd thought of that, or that I'm jealous. The best screenwriting makes me jealous. It just does. Like I go to see a movie like Shakespeare in Love or Inception, or some of these movies where you just go, or Memento, like some of the Christopher Nolan stuff, where I'm just like, I'm jealous. I can't think that way. Like that's just fascinating and amazing, and I wish I could do that. Sometimes I feel that way about Lord and Miller with like the Lego movie. We were watching the Lego movie earlier tonight with our kids, and I just thought it's just so awesome. Like it's so fun, and I get a little jealous. I'm like, oh, I wish I could have worked on that with those guys, and I get jealous of their talents, and so it's less analytical and more just a little bit of envy,
Yeah.
but in an exciting way. Like
Right.
I never begrudge anybody their success if I think they deserve it. Like I really do look up to our peers that I just think are on another level. Like Phil and Chris, Lord and Miller. I idolize those guys. I
Yeah.
do. I just think they're awesome. And I want to be like them. I just want to be able to use all the skills they do, and so I feel jealousy, but it's always this weird positive kind of jealousy where it's like, that's yeah, good on you, and I wish I could do that, and hopefully I can next time.
Yeah, like some motivation too, right? Like you
Yes.
yeah. I know like Denis for Dune 2, he was really upset that it was still the highest grossing movie. He's like, I wish somebody had trumped it by now so that I can be
Yes. So
motivated
the
for the
industry
next.
would be doing better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And now Inside Out is trumping it, so he got his wish.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's a town where I only grit my teeth really when the success happens where I feel it's undeserved, right? Then I will grit my teeth a little bit,
Yeah.
like, that movie didn't really deserve to do that well. Like, I just feel like that, or that particular person I don't feel jealous of because I don't think they're that amazing, and yet somehow it's working out for them. Like those are the few times when I kind of grit my teeth, but even that's pretty rare.
Yeah. Now, so I want to wrap this thing up. I want to ask you about future projects, anything you can talk about that you possibly have coming up that you're excited about. Maybe if you don't want to drop the titles, and then I'll have one more question after that, and we'll get you out of here.
Sure, sure, sure. No worries. I'm happy to hear myself talk, except I'm really hearing myself talk with this echo in my ears. But yeah, so we've got a movie called Balls Up
Okay.
that is about to start shooting in Australia with Peter Farrelly directing. It stars Mark Wahlberg and Paul Walter Hauser,
Okay.
and it's a buddy comedy about soccer. And I can't
Oh.
give away too much more than that, but it's going to be on Amazon. We love it to death. We think it's super silly and fun. It was a spec idea that we had that we pitched to Skydance, and they bought it. And we love Skydance so much. They're our buddies and our partners on almost everything we do these days, and it's because of how great they are. And they've seen this thing through, and Peter Farrelly is amazing, just as amazing as you'd expect and hope for, even more than you'd hope for. Like we worship him, and yet to find out he's a great person too has been really fun and exciting. So that's going to shoot in Australia starting in about a month. Hopefully come out on Amazon sometime the following year. We just finished producing a movie that our dear friend and great talent Sean Simmons wrote and directed, uh, uh, called Eeny Meeny for Fox. It shot in Cleveland. I shouldn't say it just got done shooting. It still now has to go into post-production. It won't come out until the following year, just like Balls Up. It's about a female getaway driver. It's an awesome thriller, but funny. It's got a real Tarantino-esque vibe to it. We're really excited about it. And our friend wrote and directed it, and we're producing on that one. We have a second season of our television show, Twisted Metal, coming out, which is showrun by Michael Jonathan Smith, who's doing an amazing job. And the first season, this wacky, fun, silly, gory, crazy show, and landed and it worked, and so it's coming back on Peacock. We're excited about that. And we sold another original idea to Skydance that we've written a script for that we're trying to cast right now. I can't talk about what that's about, but we got that one cooking.
Okay.
And then yeah, we just did a weekly rewrite on a movie that I'm not allowed to talk about yet, an existing movie that's about to go into production, and we worked on that and had a fun time. So, and we're about to pitch something new. So we've got a new idea. A friend of ours brought a novel to us, an old novel from the 70s that we really, really liked. And he really dug this thing out of nowhere. And it's a fun old novel from the 70s. And we're going to put together a pitch on it and try to sell it here at some point. So
All exciting stuff. Are you going out to Australia for the?
we hope to. Yeah, I think
Okay.
we will. Pete, it's really expensive to send us out there, and we don't know if it's in the budget.
Yeah.
Pete wants us to come. It's a big ticket item to get us on a plane out there and put us up in a hotel. It's a long way,
Yeah.
and so but I really want to get out there though. I want to get out to the jungle and see these guys in action because Paul Walter Hauser is brilliant and Mark Wahlberg is a national treasure, and to see them going at it and this thing is going to be really fun, I think.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to it. And then I guess the last question I want to ask you
Yes.
is, I think what a lot of the strikes were around, but I got to ask you about AI, and I got to ask you about just kind of your thoughts on it, how you think it's going to impact the industry, and yeah, just
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm no expert,
yeah,
so let me preface everything I say. I'm like a perfect layperson. Um, I'm worried about AI for everybody. I mean, I'm worried about it for all kinds of reasons. I'm worried about the dangers to humanity. I'm worried about it being in the wrong human hands. I'm worried about it getting super smart and not having its interests aligned with humanity's interests. I'm worried about the impact it'll have on employment and jobs and things like that. With regard to screenwriting, what I feel so far is that I think AI is going to wreck a lot of careers and jobs before it gets to wrecking screenwriters' careers and jobs. And I think that because I just think that there will be any number of tasks it becomes proficient at before it's able to write a really great 120-page feature screenplay.
yeah,
Um, so while I am worried, and while I do think that ultimately it will be able to do my job better than I can, because look, I just think it will. I just think technology is such that you can't predict what's coming, and I think ultimately it probably will be able to outdo me the way it outdid chess players or the way it outdoes other people and or the way it's doing with coding right now. It's like it's
yeah,
starting to program, computer programming. Um, I think it will outdo me, but it may be a later generation's worry more than mine.
yeah,
Um, I I have gone into ChatGPT and asked it to write a scene in the style of me. Like, so I went in there. It was like, write a scene between Vanessa and Deadpool on the style of Rhett Reese, because I was just curious. And so it wrote this scene, and it was remarkably coherent and worked as a scene, which kind of freaked me out. But it was also really flat and unfunny, and I don't know, it was just a little aimless, and it just didn't feel like it had a person behind it in an
yeah,
odd way. Or
yeah,
if it did, it had someone who was just aping other people as opposed to having a real creative spark or a real sense of humor. So I kind of went whew, and kind of I did that where I was like, okay, at least it's not going to replace me quite yet. And my joke was that, maybe it's so good, it's so smart that it's actually recreating my screenwriting and knows how that I'm worse than I think I am. Like, so it's like I'm like, oh, that's how I write. Oh, maybe I'm not so good. Um, but uh, but the reality was that I was comforted coming out of it more than I was terrified.
Yeah.
But what it can't do now, it may be able to do next year. Like I don't know. Like I mean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have guessed that it could come as far as it already has. And I think it's going to have this exponential quality to it where it just gets smarter and smarter and smarter. But will it ever get to the place where it can be hilariously funny or really capture the human experience in a really relatable way and think the way a person does? I think that may be just far enough off that I won't have to worry about it, that somebody else may have to worry about it.
Yeah, we're always going to be drawn to that human aspect and just the relatability of someone behind it versus AI. And like you said, who knows? I mean, because it's not a living thing, at least yet, hopefully it never gets there, but it won't be able to experience and know kind of how we interact, which hopefully will keep it at a far enough distance.
Yes, keep it at a far enough distance. That's the hope. And
Yeah,
of course, it learns from everything that humans do. And so it's learning from other movies and it's learning from all the screenwriting that's ever happened.
right,
And we use those tools too. I mean, it's clear that, I know the rules of screenwriting too, and I've only gleaned those from reading screenplays and watching movies. And so it's learned the same way I have. But I think what it's missing right now is sort of the ultimate creative spark where it can have an idea out of nowhere, right?
yeah,
That just comes from nowhere and that is relatable because it's a human idea and it came out of a human brain and it relates to human issues and problems that actually haven't been expressed before. It's like what we do, a lot of it's derivative, right? In the sense that other people have written scenes like this or movies like this have happened with these kind of act breaks, and there's certain things that are derivative, but there's also something that's inexpressibly original that would never have come to be if it weren't for me having my brain and Paul having his brain.
right.
And there's a uniqueness and an individuality to it. And the question is, when can an AI capture that element? Because what it's great at is learning everything that's ever happened until now, and aping that, kind of mimicking that.
Yeah,
Where I think it's going to be more interesting is to see how actually creative it can get at at creating something that no one's ever done or thought of. Um, and we'll see.
right, because it's just constantly pulling from its history of
Yes.
how it's
And
been.
and a movie like Memento, a movie like Memento that happens. I don't know. Have you seen Memento?
I don't know if I
Anyway,
have.
go watch it. It's
Okay.
it's it's a fascinating movie that happens kind of in reverse in pieces. Like it's structured very oddly. So, it it, these scenes play out in real time, but then the story jumps backwards, and the next scene you see is the scene that happened before the scene you just saw, and then
Whoa.
you watch that scene play through, and then it jumps backwards again. And it was such a revolutionary way to tell a story that it just boggled my mind to watch it. It still boggles my mind. Even I've seen it 5 or 6 times, and every time I watch it, my brain is struggling to sort of piece it together because it's so nonlinear and different, and yet completely original. It is unique. There's never been a movie like it before it or after it. And I think when an AI can write Memento, we're really screwed. Like I really can just turn in my Writers Guild card, like because I do think too that there is no deal the Writers Guild can make to protect writers, from that. Like because once that happens, there just won't be any writers hired ever again. The handwriting will be on the wall, and we'll just have to shrug and say, well, if the computer can entertain us better than we can, that we don't have a function anymore, and that's sad, but that'll be true. And no Writers Guild deal with studios, no contract, no negotiated contract is going to trump that. At least not for long. Like when the most recent contract expires, it'll all just unravel, and we have to accept that.
Well, hopefully it's long enough away to where.
Yes,
But
exactly.
I
Hopefully,
guess
we're in our rocking chairs. Mitch and I are talking about this in 30 years, 40 years, and it still hasn't become a problem.
yeah, that would be ideal. But we're talking about it in 40 years and it's not a problem. But um, thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you so much. And
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm I'm glad you're doing it. It's fun, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And any other way I can help, let me know.
Thank you so much. You're an inspiration, and yeah, just keep crushing it, and I'll be looking out for all your projects coming up soon.
All right. Thank you so much, Mitch.
Thanks, Rhett.
All right. Bye.
All right, bye bye.